Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I am actually still deeply immersed in reading Infinite Jest and preparing for that video and the being a guest on the Great Concavity. So I don't have anything new to share with you, at least from me today, but something really cool just recently happened. Stephen Moore, who knows I'm a little bit of an admirer of his, he actually sent me a CD of the uncut version of his 2017 interview on KCRW's Bookworm. And when I got it, I immediately, ripped it to an MP3 and I'm going to send the CD back to him. But then it kind of occurred to me that probably more people out there would want to hear it, but it didn't feel right to just throw it out there without permission. So I asked Steve Moore what he would think about it, and he was completely fine with it. But I also felt like I needed to get, of course, KCRW or Michael Silverblatt's permission, didn't know how to go about that. Stephen put me in touch with Michael Silverblatt. I composed this, what I felt was a very elegant email, and sent it. And the next day, Michael Silverblatt responded and simply asked me for my phone number, which of course put me on edge and made me a little bit nervous. I've been listening to Bookworm for at least 5 years and highly respect Silverblatt as a reader and a critic, and I just knew I would be tongue-tied or whatever. And but sure enough, he ended up calling me. I was at lunch yesterday with my wife and daughter, and all of a sudden, a Los Angeles phone number popped up on my screen, and so I stole off to a corridor and sat there and talked with Michael Silverblatt for about 30 minutes. Mostly about our mutual like for John Barth, whom Silverblatt had the pleasure of studying under at Johns Hopkins. And the phone call had to be ended early, so hopefully we can continue the discussion. But in any case, Michael Silverblatt gave me his blessing. And so what this video is, after this prolonged preamble, is simply the audio recording of the uncut version of the 2017 interview with Michael Silverblatt and Stephen Moore. I hope you all enjoy it, and you bear with me while I continue to read Infinite Jest. I've got lots of exciting content, lots of great books that I'm going to be getting around to once I'm done. Hope you enjoy, and thank you so much for watching. And now, listening.
Funds for Bookworm are provided in part by Lannan Foundation.
Where would we be without books? Where would we be without Gutenberg? It's a rhetorical question, sir, but where would we be without books?
From KCRW and KCRW.com, I'm Michael Silverblatt, and welcome to Bookworm. What a show it's going to be today. This is really special. My guest is Stephen Moore. Stephen Moore has, well, let me just name some of his accomplishments, maybe in star order, you'll forgive me. He's one of the two people that David Foster Wallace turned to for help editing Infinite Jest. That should be credential enough, but he also has helped Alexander Theroux through a novel, or maybe two. And he wrote the first books on William Gaddis, the author of The Recognitions, who was, for many people, the precursor to Thomas Pynchon. Once David said to me, David Foster Wallace, about Infinite Jest, yes, I wanted to write a long, hard book. And that's what I like. I like long, hard books.
Same here.
I like others as well. But Stephen Moore has been editing and reviewing books. He's brought writers like Ricky Ducournay unknown writers to publishers, shepherded them through that difficult period where you're getting used to the fact that your baby is going into the world. And he's been perhaps the most generous reviewer of this kind of book. Most of the time, when you get a long, hard book, or even a short, hard book, the reviewer doesn't get it and makes it the author's fault. These are very unpleasant reviews, but there's a tradition of them. Reviewers have been given permission not to understand the best books in our culture. Stephen Moore has reviewed for the Washington Post book section and, well, all over the place. He edited the review of contemporary fiction for quite a few years. He was an editor at Dalkey Archive during their peak heyday years. I'm really happy to be talking to him. He's published a book called My Back Pages, the title from the Dylan song. It's published by Zero Gram Press, and it has reviews and essays, personal and impersonal, and it's around 720 pages long. Thrilling. I'm going to begin by asking you, there's a kind of decorum that you practice in reviews. You are very gracious. And I wanted to begin by asking why, because I came out of this book feeling like a better person.
Glad to hear that. Well, I'll tell you one thing. Before I started writing criticism, I actually tried writing a novel. And I know how hard it is. And I
What was it? Clarinets is in the
Clarinets
title.
and Candles, yeah, it's a little autobiographical thing.
It was never published.
No, it's not very good. But it did teach me how difficult it is to write a novel. So whenever I'm asked to review a book, I've been there. I know how hard it is. Even to write a mediocre book takes a lot of work. But if it's more than mediocre, which is the kind I like, I'm quick to appreciate what the author accomplished. And plus, I hate negative reviews. Those don't do any good. And it's often the reviewer trying to show off, or as you say, they don't understand it, so they can't admit that. So they kind of cover up by making snide remarks or something. But I've always, I think a critic's job is to appreciate literature more than anything else. And I want to give my readers, a reason why this is worth reading, not just why I personally don't like it or like it. So I always try to take a positive spin. There's very few times have I written a negative review. But
it's a wonderful thing because Coleridge, I guess, famously said that the way to judge a novel is by its internal revelation of what it's trying to do. Mm-hmm. You don't decide what a novel is trying to do. A novel tells you what it's trying to do, and if you're a critic, you decide whether it succeeded at the task it attempted. That's what's important, exactly. Not what you wanted it to do. Mm-hmm. And I really think that in this time, since we've given so much credit to things that are just opinion, people aren't listening for long enough to see what it is that the novel is about, not what you're about.
Exactly, yes. There's one book I reviewed in there by Charles Johnson. When I first started reading it, I thought it was supposed to be a serious novel or a serious collection of essays. And I found out later that it was actually light pieces. And once I got that, I thought, okay, that's what he intended to do. So I went back and rethought it out based on what he was doing, not what I was expecting from the book. And you can't have preconceived notions. You have to come with an open mind, trust the authors. They know what they're doing. They've worked a long time on these books. So there's a thing called the intentional fallacy in some literary criticism where you're not supposed to take an author's intentions into consideration, but I think you should. I think you
Well,
need to.
there's also a difference between an author's intentions and a book's intentions.
True,
And,
yes.
And
yes.
I think that often the book is better than the writer. The book is pretending to the ability to aspire to perfection. Humans are humans, but books can be made perfect over time as the author, him or herself, learns what the intention is. There's a marvelous section in one of the later of Marilyn Robinson's books where a woman who's a teacher is told by one of the students, "I don't like the book." And the teacher says, "Read it again, and read it again, and read it again until you like it. Because this is, in fact, a great book. It's not up to you to like it or not like it. It's up to you to teach yourself to read it." And one of the things I love about what my guest, Steve Moore, says, and repeatedly, about certain books, he didn't like it at first, but when he read it again, in this case I believe he was talking about Women and Men by one of our favorite shared writers, Joseph McElroy. He said, on second reading, I started to understand it. And of course, he didn't review it. I think the review came out when the book came into paperback. But certainly, it wasn't when people were forced to read that book at hurtle pace because it was two 600-page galley books that came out without enough time for the readers to read them. Well, critics can get very frustrated, right, at being asked to read something too quickly. That was true, too, of another book we share a deep love for, William Gass's The Tunnel. The critics didn't get it early enough to appreciate it, so instead, what did they do? They made fun of it.
Right. Nabokov said that any work that deserves to be called literature has to be read twice. It's not an option. You have to read it at least twice, if not more times. Now, of course, not everyone has time to read a book several times. That's where critics come in. I mean, a critic can take the time with essays, not book reviews, to read something over and over and extract everything that the author put into it and convey that to the reader, which again is another one of the critic's jobs. Not to give his own personal opinion about literature, but to work at a novel, read it often enough background where you can actually appreciate what the author put into it.
Now, because these reviews cover what space of time?
The mostly post-World War II, from 1955 to the present.
And you begin your enthusiasms as a reader with the beats, really. And that means that those enthusiasms include an enthusiasm for popular music. And the title of the book comes from
a famous song by Bob Dylan called My Back Pages. I prefer the version by the Byrds, but it's one of his early pieces, which I've always liked.
Yeah, let's hear a little bit of it. I think it would be fun to have a little music on the show. Now, you go from the Beats to William Gaddis, it seems to me. And I think that Gaddis enters the field of what I call, with David, the long, hard book. Whereas I don't think of the beats, although I don't really know beat writing very well. It might be long, but it's not hard. It's more fun than hard.
Yeah. Well, actually, Gaddis hung out in Greenwich Village and knew Kerouac. He knew Burroughs. And several sections of the recognitions are kind of early beat settings, So he was part of that milieu. A lot of people think of him as a very intellectual writer, which he is, of course. And his novel is quite a bit different from the average beat novel. But he was part of that milieu, and he kind of came out of that. But again, the problem with Kerouac and some of those others, they're almost too popular. And as a result, a lot of people don't read them as if they were first-rate literary writers. which they are. If you really delve into Kerouac, I mean, he was really a prose poet most of the time, but he's got this reputation for just writing about wild, crazy people doing crazy things. And that's worked against him, I think. And Burroughs, with his strange novels, they seem like wild acid trips, but they're actually, he's got this kind of brutal lyricism in his writing. I mean, they're again, almost like prose poems. So
I have to confide to you that I had a phobia that my father had too, and that my niece has as well, about needles. So I couldn't read Naked Lunch until, having become a diabetic, needles become part of your daily life. I had to get over the phobia, and one of the rewards for getting over the phobia was that I was able to read William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch.
Okay.
I'm talking to Stephen Moore about a collection of his essays and reviews, My Back Pages, 720 or so pages. You see, eventually you read, and then you read and read, and then you read and read and read. There's a Lydia Davis piece about this. But then you start to forget what you read because you've read so much. And a book like My Back Pages, for me, is like eating ice cream and cookies. Bearing in mind that I am a diabetic, it's delicious to recall these books. Who are some of the other writers that we share passions for? Because we do.
I started reading all these people in the 70s, which was really a heyday for, you had like Robert Coover, John Barth.
John Barth.
Yeah, and the great Stanley Elkin. He doesn't
Stanley
give, what a
Elkin.
wordsmith he was. And Gilbert Sorrentino, even though he was associated with poetry also, but he wrote some of his best novels, I think, in the 70s. We mentioned Joseph McElroy, Donald Barthelme. I mean, that was what a magic. I mean, I think the 70s were a terrible decade for music and fashion and pet rocks and everything, and politics, but it was really a golden age for American novelists. And even elsewhere, in France, you had Georges Perec writing Life, a User's Manual, which is a very brainy kind of book. And
you have, because of it, writers like Raymond Queneau, who was spectacularly witty, and
Yes.
this was wit both in content and in style and in structure.
right.
It's a triplicate that these books have to perform, and I would say that plot is the lowest level.
Mm-hmm.
The gymnastics really begin to become impressive when you watch the style transform as the plot transforms.
Or you've probably seen that his book Exercises in Style, where he tells one anecdote was like 60 different times, and the anecdote itself, the plot, so to speak, is nothing. It's the style, his variations. That's what makes it interesting. And for me, that's always, I don't really care about the story. A novel can be about anything. It's the language for me, and all these people have that sort of focus on language, and the grander the better.
Yes, that book, Exercises in Style by Raymond Queneau, is about someone noticing something on a bus and then getting off, having forgotten his hat, I believe. Something like that. And this story is told 60 times in 60 different styles, one more hilarious than the other. Sometimes it's told, say, in Pig Latin. Sometimes it's told backward or in rhyme. It's really, Queneau knows that a story gets better and funnier the more times you tell it. It becomes almost a fable, no matter how empty it is of important content. In fact, you can tell it better because you don't have to be paying attention to an endless parade of difficult complications and events. We love a writer named Alexander Theroux, where the point is, as Theroux liked to say, that he's using words that have not been used in 500 or 600 years.
Yes.
Tell me about your involvement with Theroux.
I first read him in the early 80s when Darkonville's Cat came out, and that's the novel where he boasted about using that kind of arcane vocabulary, but not for arcane's sake or to show off. He's a very precise writer, and he wants the most precise word, and if it happens to be one that hasn't been used since the 18th century, he'll use it. And it was a culmination of everything I like. I mean, the grand style, a real brainy, intellectual style, but at the same time very
hilarious,
charming and funny, and it had like everything you could want in a novel was there. And it's not really difficult to read, but it's also, very. It can be difficult if you want to start tracing all of his allusions and intellectual effort and all that. It just seemed to be a perfect meld of everything I liked about fiction. So it became a wonderful novel for me. And then I kept in touch. I wrote actually some of the first articles that have been written about Theroux in the 1980s, which are published in this new book.
How old are you now?
Me? I'm 65.
Me too. Just about. Almost.
I'll be turning 66 in May, so I'm almost...
I'll be turning 65 in August.
But I was in my 30s then and just really excited about literature, and Theroux just seemed to hit all my buttons. And then I kept in touch with him, and at Dalkey Archive we published his collected poems. And then in 2004 or so, he had this new novel called Laura Warholic, and I volunteered to copy edit for him.
Well, as a matter of fact, I had Gary Groth
of
Fantagraphics books on my show, and one of the great things about Fantagraphics is that they not only publish the best, I think, the most advanced graphic novels, they publish Alexander Theroux's new work and also the work of Stephen Dixon, who you write about here. It is a happy family.
It is. And this summer he's publishing the collected essays of W.M. Spackman, who's a novelist. I assume you like him.
Very much.
Yeah, he's another stylist. I mean, the plots in his stories are just souffles. I mean, it's the language that makes W.M. Spackman so
What's
wonderful.
Wrong with souffles?
But he also, in addition to his wonderful novels, which I was able to edit at Dalkey Archive, a collection of them, he also wrote brilliant criticism, which most people don't know about. So I'm very happy to be bringing that book out.
Well, I read his long essay on Henry Green. Am I right? Let's take this out if I'm wrong.
He wrote a long essay on Henry James. Maybe you're thinking that?
No. I think Henry Green, but I could be...
He admired Henry Green a lot. He mentions him quite often. I don't know if he has an essay on him. But
okay, we'll take that out. Yeah. Don't worry. I can be wrong, too.
He was a classicist.
I mean, in addition to Wright, not in addition to you.
Spackman was a classicist, so he knew Greek and Latin, so he reviewed a lot of new translations of the classics in the 70s, and they're just some of the most brilliant reviews of translations that you could ever read. I'll just...
Now, I'm going to ask you a difficult and puzzling question.
Okay.
William Spackman... His first book was called An Armful of Warm Girl. And at that time...
his first novel was called Heyday. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then but it wasn't barely noticed.
Yeah. Then he restarted his career with An Armful of Warm Girl. Yes.
Yes, and quite a few years after Heyday.
Yeah,
yes.
About 15 years or so.
Yes. And people noticed. It was a beautiful book. And back then, people would praise the title. Now today, An Armful of Warm Girl, you might not be able to say that title to the wrong group. And let's also add that the second half of Alexander Theroux's big novel, Darkonville's Cat, is a history virtually of misogyny. Darkonville has been jettisoned by the girl he thought he loved.
Mm-hmm.
He feels betrayed. He meets a sinister doctor who teaches him the ways of misogyny. And the second half is really and intended to be a vilification of women. Now, we no longer take this very easily, and it's not a mistake, I think, that because of it, Darkenville's Cat remains out of print. How do you deal with the fact that a real favorite book of yours has gone out of print because of these kinds of social matters?
I'm really upset by that. I think political correctness is a horrible thing that's happened to the universities, and I shouldn't be applied to literature. I mean, remember Oscar Wilde said there's no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Either it's well written or it's not. And I think for me, that's the only thing that matters. Is a book well executed, well written? If so, it can be the most negative thing in the world, and yet it should be still appreciated for its style. When you bring politics into, or gender expectations, or political ideology, and start judging a novel by that, you're barking up the wrong tree, and I think you're insulting the author, because that's not what they're about. I mean, in Darkenville's Cat, for example, it's Dr. Crucifer is the misogynist. Darkenville falls under his spell for a short period, but then he wakes up and realizes that's horrible stuff. So it's not that Theroux is misogynist or the novel is. That's just one of the plot points. And mostly that misogyny is just an excuse for Theroux to show off his wide knowledge of misogynistic traditions and literature and all that. I mean, there's artistic reasons for that. It's not just a slap at women. And yet too many political correct types, they don't see that. They see a negative word or a negative attitude, and it's a snap decision, and they don't want to have anything to do with it.
I'm Michael Silverblatt, and you're listening to Bookworm from the studios of KCRW. I'm talking with Stephen Moore, a fantastic critic whose book on the origins of the novel won the Christian Goss Award for criticism. He decided that he would tell us not just that the novel starts with Don Quixote, he'd tell us where Don Quixote came from. And Don Quixote, because we're talking about matters of ethnicity and political correctness, Don Quixote comes from novels that were published in Asia, in India. You know, it's not a Western tradition. And learning that we have traditions from all over the place that bring us to the most unconventional ideas about writing. The Arabian Nights is about a potentate who kills a virgin a night until Scheherazade, a heroic woman, comes to rescue her sisters. I'm Michael Silverblatt. You're listening to Bookworm from the studios of KCRW. I'm talking with Stephen Moore about his book, My Back Pages. We'll continue after this short break. I'm Michael Silverblatt. This is Bookworm, and I'm talking with Stephen Moore about his latest book, My Back Pages, a compendium of his book reviews that now serves as a history of modern fiction since the 1970s. Now, you've become a monument to omnivorousness in a culture that isn't, by and large, omnivorous about books at this point, at this moment of the world. What are we going to do?
I don't know. I know the audience for literary works is probably shrinking, but there'll always be an audience for it. And one of the things I've tried to do in this book and almost all of mine is to preserve authors that deserve to be well known. I was afraid, like Gaddis, when I first discovered him, it was 20 years after his first book. No one had written about it, or very few people. No one knew about it. And up until, including this one, my goal has always been to preserve these people for the small number of people that are always going to be like these books.
I think you're being modest, Steve. And is it okay if I call you Steve?
Of course.
You see, I think one of the pleasures of my back pages, as I was reading, there were a great number of books here that I haven't read, and he writes about them so well that I was ordering books and making lists of books to buy, because, I want you, when you listen to one of my shows, to feel like you need to read this book, that it doesn't just sound interesting. You can't stand not having it in your hands. And the wonderful David Markson says about Moore, he praises his ability to make a simple plot summary tingle with excitement. The infectious sense of sheer literary pleasure that bubbles through it all. If this isn't a critical masterpiece in the making, there ain't no such animal. And, when was the last time that you enjoyed works of review criticism? It's really a great pleasure to read Stephen Moore. He's often quite funny. Because you like so many writers who celebrate in puns, you're not ashamed of puns, and you have a good deal of fun. If you can joke, you'd rather make the joke than stifle it, yeah?
Oh, yes. That's the kind of writing I like to read, and especially with my novel history, I just gave myself permission to have fun with it because I figured if I had fun, the reader would have fun. And I didn't want it to be one of these dry as dust tomes that only professors would read. And also, I'm so glad to hear you're actually buying these books, because this new book of mine, for example, this isn't about me. This isn't about just my thoughts on literature. This is telling people that there are some wonderful novels out there that they might not have heard of, and you should, it's about them. I wanted to have encourage people to go out and find their works. So that meant describing them in as attractive manner as possible, not a supercilious, snotty manner that some critics use.
Well, I think at any given time, and I mean at any given time, people are unlikely to know the best novels because the bigger publishers are putting so much money into making sure you know the money, where the money goes.
Right.
And so you often as not don't hear about the efforts of independent, what used to be called literary presses, and we now call them independent presses. There are more than ever. And they're bringing back into print books that have been nearly forgotten,
Yes.
and they're publishing new ones. And we're really, in fact, living in great literary times, because suddenly those mainstream so-called publishers are still paying six-figure advances sometimes for books that don't succeed. It's not, this business is not a business in all sorts of ways. The literary presses are doing their best to find newer writers to publish their most dangerous works. Think, for instance, of Maggie Nelson's most recent book. It's from, I believe, Grey Wolf. Coffee House is doing amazing jobs. There are literary presses, Tin House, all over the place, reclaiming and discovering in editions that you can afford. And it's really nice to be reading books again without knowing what it is I'm going to be reading. You heard Valeria Luiselli here and her wonderful husband, Connie. What is his name, quickly? What? Alvaro Enrique, Sudden Death. These are books that I didn't know about. I pick them up. I try, when I find exciting ones, to tell my listeners about them. They're the secrets. They're the best secrets of the culture. What are the books that are exciting you right now? Who are your new writers?
I'd love, well, he's not so new, but Mark Danielewski, I think, is a towering talent and presence. I mean, he's doing something extraordinary with not only the novels he's written for the last 15 years, but this new series of his. I like Reef Larson. He writes in that sort of encyclopedic tradition I like. He's really good.
Both of these writers have been on Bookworm, and here in Los Angeles, where from which Bookworm emanates on KCRW, Mark Danielewski lives here, so he's a local national treasure.
Deservedly so. But I don't know if I can name that many others because, as you said, it's hard to keep track. There's so many things coming out, especially by younger writers, that are worth, readable, or very interesting, but they're from small presses. They don't often get reviewed, and I find myself just kind of stumbling upon things rather than being led to the things I should read. So,
well, let's though ask, because it is an important question. I remember thinking when I first read John Barth that my parents, who hadn't heard of him, and especially my mother, who tried to read The Saltweed Factor, she really wanted to read these books that I was finding so exciting at age 18. Our elders didn't read these books, and now I fear, as an elder, not reading the books I ought to be reading, that younger people are discovering correctly, and because of what remains of the famous generation gap, that the news isn't reaching me. And I always want to feel that I'm being made aware, by whatever means possible, of the best new things that are being published.
Yes, I feel that way, and I try to keep on track. I subscribe to the PW Publishers Weekly's daily thing, and then a few other things, but it's just too much, and I can't. So,
Well, you had a built-in information system. For some time, you worked in bookstores. You had your own bookstore. You really were keeping track of what there was. You were the main buyer for Borders while Borders still existed. So, knowing what's happening in part has to do with being in the right place at the right time, yeah?
Yeah, that helped immensely. I was getting publishers' catalogs all the time and knowing about things 6 months in ahead. And some of the sales reps would tell me about things, even though I bought one section, like mostly science and nonfiction. They would tell me about things and send me galleys. So if you're a part of the industry, you can kind of keep up with these things, but the average person, of course, isn't. And where do they find out? I mean, I've been railing against the inadequacies of the book review industry ever since I found out how Gaddis was pretty much dismissed by them. And that's a perennial problem, getting the word out, especially with the smaller titles, because, as you pointed out, the publishers want to publicize, put all their money behind the big books that they're going to hope to get the returns on. So, but you just kind of, word of mouth, of course, and that's one thing that's really changed. Word of mouth 30 years ago was almost literally one person telling another. Now social media there's so many blogs and things that do get the word out, but it's almost, again, too much, and you have to know where to look. But I'll have to say I'm really impressed by that and how quickly people are responding. I mean, in the old days, a novel would come out and it'd be years before someone wrote about it. But nowadays, someone like Alan Moore published a big, gigantic novel called Jerusalem last fall. And within months, there was websites that were starting to provide annotations for his novels and, study guides and stuff. I mean, that's very encouraging, I think.
Yes, let's bear in mind that does happen. And now, if you were to want to read Ulysses or Gravity's Rainbow or the long poem by Louis Zukofsky, there are sites which will help you through all those mountainous illusions. These need not be the difficult works they once were, because these blogs are group procedures. You may find your name if you find a secret annotation. You can put it in and get your name next to it, and you will forever have identified this little moon crater with your name on it that is one strange joke moment in a book so full of jokes that you'll never count them all. I don't know that there is such a thing for Darkenville's Cat, is there?
No, there isn't. I started writing one back in the 80s, but I abandoned it. But to your point, though, I mean, there is a lot of that out there for more books than ever happened before. And most of them, of course, are by amateurs. I mean, amateurs in the best sense of the word. People who really love what they're doing. They're not professors.
Amateur comes like from amatory. It comes from the root of to love.
Yeah, so...
An amateur is one who loves without being paid.
So that's encouraging, but again, there's just keeping up with it is just overwhelming.
Well, but what isn't overwhelming, and it seems to me that even before the web, it was easy to be overwhelmed. That's the nature of living in a culture.
Right. And when you have, I don't know how many tens of thousands of books published every year, and let's say there's 1,000 a year that are literary, and maybe let's say 500 a year. No one has time to read 500 books a year. So even if you found out about them all, even if you're rich enough to buy them all, you still wouldn't have time to read them all. So it's an embarrassment of riches almost, and it's all the more important, I think, for critics. That's where I come in, just to try to point readers to the ones at least I think that are worth reading, and do so in a very positive way.
Now, help me. One of the things that was said, the recognitions by William Gaddis, about which we've been speaking, and we've been speaking about it because Stephen Moore has written several books about it, including one Reader's Annotated Edition.
Yeah, that was my first book.
Yes. And it came out to a combination of neglect and dismissive reviews. Many of the reviewers saying, this is inferior copycat Ulysses stuff, not wanting to take into account that the author, Gaddis, said that he hadn't read Ulysses. Now, it's a wild question, because if he hadn't read Ulysses, you'd have to actually prove that to me, but certainly at that time, he knew enough about Ulysses. If you cared about literature, you were hearing about Ulysses. So, to some extent, there are two sides to this question. Where do we decide when a book becomes, these long, hard novels, too much the inheritor of the original long, hard novels of the modernist period, like Ulysses, or like some of the novels by Wyndham Lewis, or the cantos of Ezra Pound? Are these really still books of our time, and why?
Well, the Gaddis part is easy. I think the Recognitions and the Ulysses really don't have much in common. They're both long books, and they're both rather erudite. And I'm afraid that the early book reviewers, that's all they saw. They didn't see anything past that. And it was a lazy way of saying, okay, he must have copied Ulysses. But he didn't. I mean, Gaddis actually told me, and I believe him, that he only read the last chapter, Molly Bloom's monologue from Ulysses, and not the rest. And he was only reading that just for the naughty bits. So it was a very superficial thing. And I think, Gaddis was actually he was writing in the spirit of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. They wrote big books, and that's what he was going for. Taking on the entire culture and writing a big, ambitious novel like that, rather than imitating Joyce. And he loved T.S. Eliot, of course. And Eliot is very elusive. So he was working from that tradition. So now, as far as later writers, I think every writer looks back at the writers that they like to emulate. So Joyce was a pioneer in that there wasn't really anything like Ulysses back then, except you go back to Rabelais, perhaps, or Cervantes. But David Foster Wallace was really impressed by Gravity's Rainbow, for example, and Mark Danielewski was probably impressed by maybe Gaddis and Pynchon. So every new generation comes along and looks back at the big novels that impressed them, and they want to obviously try to write something similar to that. So but that's the way it's always been. There's certain writers who read Thomas Wolfe back in the 30s, and they want to write something like that. Kerouac, but so that part is understandable. Every writer picks out some models, and they try to build on that.
Now, you say in your essays here on Alexander Theroux that you have to confide that Darkenfield's Cat is your very favorite book. Well, let's, coming to the end here, first, tell me why.
Well, as I said earlier, it has everything I like about great literature, which is, first of all, a great style. It's very sarcastic and funny. I don't like ultra serious books. That's why I'm not a big fan of Tolstoy, for example, and there's no laughs in Tolstoy. Whereas my favorite writers are all kind of sarcastic. It's whimsical at times. It's filled with hatred at other times. It has all the emotions. It doesn't just cover a few aspects of the human condition. It kind of touches upon everything. It's very elusive. You learn. He draws upon literary traditions that go back to the ancient Greeks. So it's almost an encyclopedia of the novel itself, as well as being an encyclopedic novel. It just has everything that I look for in fiction.
Well, I wondered, because I read the whole book,
mm-hmm.
and toward the end, in your personal section, you have an essay called Nympholepsy, in which you describe having fallen in love when you were working at a bookstore with a young woman who came to work at the bookstore. You were both readers, and you were in love, and it's a heartbreaking essay. You say the things that it hurts to hear, that you feared that you'd never been loved, that you'd never be in love. And the plot of the essay is in many ways the plot of Darkenfield's Cat, not down to betrayal, actually, but a young woman who is not the equal of the man speaking, who chooses someone her own age, her own class, to be with. And I wondered, usually we say a novel attracts us because of its own internal bliss, its own specialness.
Mm-hmm.
But here, I think this suggests something that's also true, that we love the novels that speak to us about who we are. And when we find a novel like this, even though it was years later, you were responding to the fact that the author, Alexander Theroux, was capable of the same kind of huge and loving error that you could later make. Do you feel that reading in a novel, one's own biography, is a shoddy thing to do? Because I don't.
No, that's literary critics we can talk all we want about structural and structure and formal matters and this and that, but ultimately we are attracted to novels that speak to our worldview or give us something or resonate with us on a personal level that almost has nothing to do with the professional literary stuff. So I'm as I said earlier, I don't read books for plots, but there are some plots that obviously appeal to me and others. You didn't like to read novels with needles in them. I don't like to read violent books. I hate really. That's why I don't read Cormac McCarthy. He may be a great writer, but I just don't like really violent books. So I think, we can't get away from that. Even the most professional, hard-headed critic, we seek out those books that speak to a certain part of us. Now, to be honest, until this moment, I had not made that connection between my essay and Darknville. But
I got to tell you, as I read your essay, I knew you hadn't made the connection because otherwise you'd have mentioned it.
Yeah.
And yet I think frequently as readers, and maybe even the more we read others, the less we know ourselves. Reading is itself an act of extension, that we enter the sensibility of others. That's why I think readers tend to be more compassionate, see more deeply into more things than other people do. It's one of the reasons for reading that people don't tend to mention. You will understand others better the more people you meet in the course of reading books, and more important, the more kinds of people.
Exactly. Different classes, different nationalities, you learn different temperaments. It's a great way of becoming more empathetic and just more sympathetic to the human condition.
I found myself deeply empathizing with this literary critic, Stephen Moore. We had many things in common, matters of taste, matters of pleasure. It's always fun to share, although it wasn't when I was a wee one. My parents had to beg me to share my raisins, and I didn't want to. But I'm always happy about sharing a book. That's what both of us do for our lives. I on my show, you in your criticism. That's what we do. We tell people about things they might not just like, but might come to love if they give them a chance. I've been talking with Stephen Moore, the author of a collection of criticism that spans the years, spans the modern novel. It's My Back Pages. It's published by Zerogram. Stephen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
You can comment on today's show or read an excerpt from My Back Pages at kcrw.com/bookworm. Download the podcast from kcrw.com or from iTunes. You can also listen on demand with KCRW's smartphone apps. My co-producer is Connie Alvarez. Alan Howard is associate producer. The technical director is Mario Diaz. Special thanks to my assistant, David Sobel. I'm Michael Silverblatt. Join me again next time on Bookworm.
I am a bookworm, he is a bookworm, she is a bookworm, we are all bookworms. And we're just read this, read that, read this, read this, read that, read this, read this, read that, read this, read that. I am a bookworm, we are all bookworms.
Funds for Bookworm are provided in part by Lannan Foundation. This program is produced in the studios of KCRW Santa Monica. You can access archives of all Bookworm programs and podcast the most recent ones at kcrw.com/bookworm. The Bookworm themes were composed and performed by Ron and Russell Mail of Sparks.
Read this, read that, read this, read this, read that, read this. I am a bookworm, he is a bookworm, she is a bookworm, we are all bookworms.